Universal Fraternity is an idea that comes to us from the great wisdom traditions of Christianity and Judaism. The Bible is full of stories about fraternity or brotherhood, often fraternal relations going wrong, such as in the story of Cain's killing of Abel in a fit of envious rage. At a deeper level, these stories are trying to teach us something about human relations. By portraying Cain's fratricide of Abel as the first sin of one human being against another, and thereby suggesting that every murder is the killing of a brother, this Old Testament story starts to point the way to a more universal understanding of fraternity. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, we see further development of the idea of the universal brotherhood of the human family in the commandments to provide assistance and justice to the poor, widows, orphans, and even foreigners. In the New Testament, we see the idea of universal fraternity still further developed, as Jesus relativizes, without replacing, family relationships based on blood ties by emphasizing the universal or common fatherhood of God. It is this vertical relationship with the Father, made possible through Christ the Son, that allows the further possibility of a universal horizontal relationship among all people as brothers and sisters. We can see the force of this idea brought home in Jesus' commandment to love not only friends and neighbors, but also enemies and persecutors. And we can see it illustrated in the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan. So we have this idea that grows out of a wisdom tradition. What is it about the world's great wisdom traditions that might make them fruitful sources of innovative thinking, particularly about relationships among human beings and between human beings and their environment?
The wisdom traditions, the religious traditions, their fundamental strength is that they give us a vision of reality on which we can base the notion of fraternity and the work of fraternity. One of the challenges is that the different wisdom traditions have different visions of the nature of the world, the nature of human beings, and the relationship between them. And so there is often a clash of understanding. In the modern world, there is a universal language which has arisen from the development of modernity and the impact of modernity all across the world. However, what's understood by those terms is different according to each tradition. When an individual or group which is rooted in a particular tradition uses a concept, it's important that that person or that group is true to their own tradition.
I think for traditions to have conversations with each other, there need to be points of contact, right? And I think we are all human beings. As human beings, we all have similar problems: how to face death, right? How to organize a state, whether we should go to war with other peoples. I think that's the point of contact. But then if we share everything, there's no need of conversation, right? We're just talking to ourselves.
Universality indeed depends on and needs particularity. When we think of some of the great universal ideas like human dignity or human rights or fraternity, they are in danger of remaining superficial if they are not rooted in a particular context, in a concrete environment. And I think this is why faith traditions are actually superbly in place for providing that kind of rootedness, for showing how human dignity, human rights, fraternity is actually tied to and rooted in this particular tradition. So I think the stronger the roots are, the stronger will the universal appeal and impact be.
In the Christian tradition, then fraternity is rooted in a sense of a common origin in God, in a common understanding of the priority of love of God and love of neighbour. And that grounds the understanding of what fraternity is and also the motivation for doing it. And so in different traditions you will have a different grounding and a different motivation for the practice of what we call fraternity. I think it's important to understand that the different traditions don't mean the same thing. One example of a tradition which is very different is that of Swami Vivekananda, who lived at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. He developed a very strong notion of fraternity in the sense of all people having a single origin. But his understanding of that was rooted in a tradition very different from Christianity. Vivekananda drew his inspiration from a tradition known as Advaita Vedanta, in which the core understanding is that the divine and the spiritual dimension of each human being is identical. We have the divine within us. And so for Vivekananda, the basis for fraternity was our identity with each other and our common identity in the divine. So he said that we should practice service of each other because the other is ourselves and the other is God. And so in serving each other, we are serving ourselves, but we're also worshipping God.
So in that sense, I think Chinese civilization is quite different from other major civilizations, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indian, later Greek and Roman were in general Western traditions. For one thing, there's nothing like the Abrahamic God, the God that is jealous, that doesn't allow you to believe in other gods, and also. Very early on, around 500 BCE, China entered a stage. If you have to find a similarity in Europe, it's sort of like the European early modernity, 1500 to 1800 AD, right? So China entered a period similar to that, but just 2,000 years earlier. But they also came out with quite different answers. You don't have the small communities anymore, you have large societies of strangers. And one issue for all human beings, for all human political institutions, is how to find this kind of bond, right? When you have small communities, you could have friendship, right? You could have family structure. But when you have large societies, friendship, family structures wouldn't work anymore. You need to find something that can connect strangers together. So I think in this process, Confucius introduced this idea of universal compassion, which I think resonates with Pope Francis' idea of universal fraternity. We, as human beings, will have this compassion, but this inborn universal compassion is rather fragile. We need to cultivate this very fragile compassion. And where do we do it? In family, right? Everyone has a family in order to survive. Even an orphan has people who raised him or her, right? And so family is a place where you learn you are loved in the first place, but also it's the place where you learn to love others. So for Confucians, just try to learn to love your parents. Try to learn that you are not the center of the universe, right? And when you learn that, try to push that care outward. So love your grandparents, then push that care for elders in your neighborhood, right? Then eventually, if you are successful, you can love every human being, even every animal, any plant, and every stone in the world. But for Confucians, because the reason you love your neighbors is that the suffering of your neighbors reminds you of the suffering of someone closer to you, like your grandma, right? And so in that sense, the love of closer ones should be stronger than the love of people farther away. So the Confucian ideal is universal but hierarchical or unequal care. Whereas in my very limited understanding of Christianity or of this idea of universal fraternity, the idea is to love everyone equally. I think that's a point of difference. I think both ideas have their merits and demerits, and probably that's why we can learn from each other, from these different wisdom traditions.
So another example of a tradition which is very different from Christianity is that of Mahayana Buddhism. In Mahayana Buddhism, there's a strong emphasis on the practice of compassion. We experience the sufferings of each other as our own sufferings. And this is rooted in the Buddhist understanding of the nature of reality. The Buddhist understanding of the nature of reality is that everything is in a state of flux, in a state of motion. So from the Buddhist perspective, everything is interconnected. And so there is a certain type of identity between all things. So in feeling the sufferings of other people as our own sufferings, we are experiencing identity within the Buddhist understanding of reality. But this understanding of reality is very different from that of Christianity. There is no God in Buddhism. There is no single origin in God. There's only a single origin in this universal flow of entities or events. But nonetheless, out of that tradition, we get a strong emphasis on empathy, on compassion, on what we might call, from a Christian perspective, fraternity.
But can we have any confidence that ideas from ancient wisdom traditions have the potential to help us think in innovative ways about the problems we face today? To put the question another way, if we wanted to convince people that the great wisdom traditions of the world might still be the source of powerful and innovative ideas today, what evidence could we point to?
We must not underestimate the potential for innovation in faith traditions. And innovations, for one, requires the ability to also go against mainstream thinking. If we were stuck only in what everyone else is doing, that would be the death to all innovative thinking. And faith traditions actually have the resource to be countercultural, because usually they have a higher authority that they claim to adhere to. So that is what gives them the motivation and the strength to be countercultural. And that's direly needed for innovation. Second, innovation requires constructive and critical engagement. For us, this means particularly a multi-faith perspective. And third, innovation requires courage and hope. And here again, faith traditions are superbly positioned to act courageously within a grammar of hope. Faith traditions take seriously suffering and need and death, but refuses to let these have the last word.
I think one thing that is very important is that we don't impose on people who belong to other traditions our own worldview, our own understanding. I mean, one danger of the fact that the notion of fraternity has arisen in modern times in a Jewish and Christian context is that we then try and impose the whole background of the notion of fraternity when we interact with other people. So respecting the particular traditions is important. What's interesting is that we can actually work together to pursue a common goal, even though we do have different motivations for doing so.
The Jubilee year of 2000, that's quite an interesting case study actually. And when we look at what happened there, it started, of course, many years back. You know, the Jubilee tradition goes back to the Hebrew Bible, when God said every 50th year you are meant to release everyone from their debts. And that's a pretty drastic plan actually, and clearly it did not happen in much of our history. But before the turn of the millennium, smart people looked at odious debt in many so-called third world countries. And they realized these countries are never going to get free. They are trapped in that odious debt. Much of their state budget actually goes into paying the debt to the rich countries in the West. So what happened then? And from the perspective of history, of faith-based organization, this is really interesting. Faith-based organizations came together, formed a broad alliance, including the Vatican, including evangelical Christians, including many others. And they engaged in something they have not really done before, namely political advocacy. They went lobbying to their governments, to stakeholders, to the World Bank, and said, this is not how this can continue. We are crippling many countries. And that actually worked. And that's the amazing part of that story. There was actually a decision that at least some of the countries with the most odious debts were released, or at least partly released of these debts, to have a chance for future.
In 2021, there was the COP26 meeting in Glasgow to discuss climate change. During that time, Pope Francis called together leaders from the different religious traditions to discuss how they could work together to support this initiative. Pope Francis talked about the crisis, ecological crisis, as being rooted in a crisis of values, of ethical and spiritual values. What was interesting in the Pope's approach was that he spoke about the spiritual and ethical basis for a positive concern for the environment from within the resources of the Christian tradition. So he addressed from within the resources of the Christian tradition the leaders of the other religious traditions, inviting them, in effect, to respond from the resources of their own traditions to the same problem, in the hope that by working together from the perspective of these different traditions, there could be an understanding of what this ethical and spiritual values were that were needed to support a change of attitude towards the environment.
Il documento sulla fratellanza umana rappresenta un momento storico, incoronare un cammino che è iniziato molto prima per portare a scrivere il documento, e soprattutto al momento storico della firma avvenuta ad Abu Dhabi, ed è stato sottoscritto da Papa Francesco e dal grande imam il 4 febbraio 2019. Per esempio, dal documento sulla fratellanza umana abbiamo lavorato negli ultimi anni per sviluppare, per seminare il seme della fratellanza umana. Da questo seme sono usciti dei frutti concreti, per esempio la casa abramica ad Abu Dhabi, che è stata inaugurata più di un anno fa, dove c'è una moschea, una chiesa, una sinagoga nello stesso spazio, per dire che ognuno di noi può credere e pregare Dio senza vedere in questo motivo di odiare o di fare la guerra all'altro. Un altro frutto del documento sulla fratellanza umana è la giornata mondiale riconosciuta dalle Nazioni Unite come giornata mondiale per la fratellanza umana proprio il 4 febbraio, il giorno in cui il Santo Padre e il Grande Imam hanno sottoscritto il documento. Un altro frutto della fratellanza umana è l'istituzione di associazioni e fondazioni come l'Associazione Bambino Gesù, come la Fondazione Fratellanza Umana, che lavorano per trasformare il documento, la parola fratellanza in azioni concrete, attraverso opere di carità, attraverso soccorrere come il buon samaritano i fratelli e le sorelle in bisogno.